So thank you so much for joining us today to talk polling. We're going to share today the results of our latest national water poll. I think this is the third national poll the Water Hub has done, and we've also done a few regional and state polls looking at a range of water topics. Since we have a bunch of new to us attendees today, I would love to briefly introduce the Water Hub. The Water Hub is a program of Climate Nexus, and basically we're a pro bono communication shop for the water movement. We do research like this poll, as well as media analysis, and we have a whole workshop series that happens throughout the years on topics from working with online influencers to giving good interviews to digital accessibility. We provide also a range of hands-on help from, being strategy thought partners with various campaigns in the water movement to help with writing, design, pitching, and media list building. And we're focused in the Western United States because a lot of our funding is regional, but we also work across the country and have increasingly been focused on federal policy. And you'll see in this poll that we actually asked a number of questions about two policies, both infrastructure implementation as well as Farm Bill priorities, and also talked about the Clean Water Act. I'm super excited to be joined by my colleague Molly today. Molly, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure. My name is Molly Fish-Friedman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Senior Manager of Survey Research here at Climate Nexus. So happy to work with the Water Hub on many a poll, and I'm really excited to be here to talk about this poll and help answer any methodology questions or any of the nitty-gritty about our polling.
Thank you, Molly. Nicole Lampe, Managing Director of the Water Hub. I also use she, her pronouns. And I want to briefly pop up the pictures of the rest of the Water Hub team. Sarah Bucci, who is currently on vacation, also contributed to this poll. And then various team members lead other workshops and campaigns. And many of them are on and may pop into the Q&A to help respond to questions. And we're super appreciative to the Clean Water for All Coalition and the Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus, both for providing input into the poll questions and for helping us get connected with all of you. Molly, do you want to talk a little bit about methodology?
Yes, so we fielded this poll in June. We interviewed 2,184 registered voters, and a little bit about how we poll. We often partner with the climate change communications programs at Yale and George Mason universities to kind of vet our methodology, for them to look at our questions and make sure that everything seems as good as it can be. And we were able to field this poll, and there's a margin of error for the overall numbers of about 2%. So that's pretty standard for the size of a national poll.
Thanks, Molly. Briefly, I want to talk about how we use polling at Climate Nexus. My colleague Hunter Cutting often says that polling results can either be a roadmap or a weather report, meaning we can either treat them as prescriptive and only speak to what voters are already on board with, or we can use them to inform our strategy and notice where there are gaps in understanding, or where there's often what we see, and we'll see it in this poll specifically, is that voters are on board with big picture principles that we care about in the water movement, climate action, for instance, resilience, equity, but that support drops when we're talking about specific policies. And I think that's often an indicator that we need to do a better job connecting the dots. So we'll get into the specifics, but I just wanted to flag that because, there at times when you test specific policies, and we have a couple in here, the results are super encouraging and you're like, yes, the public is with us. Sometimes they're not with us, but that doesn't mean we can't get them there. And so I don't want anyone to be discouraged by some of the poll results we're going to share today. These are the focus areas for the poll. As I said, we're looking at what voters want us to focus on in the water space. Both, we polled before the Inflation Reduction Act or reconciliation package passed. But I think a lot of the big picture questions that we asked about water infrastructure will be relevant to some of those drought and other dollars in the most recent package. We asked a bunch of questions about drinking water, as well as clean water, food and farm policy, and drought. And I want to mention that, you know, we always try to fill gaps with our polls. So there are wonderful polls out there, like the U.S. Water Alliance's Value Water Poll that are done annually. State of the Rockies is a regional poll in the West that's done annually. Public Policy Institute of California does annual polls about the environment. We just did in June, actually, a roundup of recent water polls, including a number of state polls that Water Hub conducted, funders like Walton Family Foundation, Water Foundation. So if you want to dig deeper into like the regional or state level, we'll include the link to that briefing in the follow-up email that I send. And that follow-up email will also include the slides, the recording, a link to the top lines. And then if you want to dig deeper into the crosstabs, we're happy to share those as well, where you can look at, you know, results by political party or racial and ethnic group, age, et cetera. So first, I want to lead with a little bit of good news. So many folks on this call have been asserting for years that water is a human right. And voters are with us. Nearly 9 in 10 agree that access to water that is specifically safe and affordable water is a human right. And how we get there is the topic of our first poll section on federal infrastructure implementation. Actually, before I show that, I'm going to pop up a poll because we asked folks, what do they think we ought to prioritize in terms of water infrastructure spending? And I would love to hear what you think voters chose as their top priority. Just give it a minute or so. You know, there are a few options to read through. So far, you all are right on target. All right, I'm going to share the results. So you all correctly guessed that voters are very invested and want the government to invest in delivering safe drinking water. What followed that actually surprised me a little bit. You all chose that keeping water service affordable would be their next priority, followed by drought and flood preparedness. I'll stop this share and pop up the results. So as you guessed, delivering safe drinking water was far and away the top priority. I was surprised, however, that handling sewage safety was next. Flood and drought preparedness was actually down near the bottom of the list. That is not to say that voters don't want people to invest in that. In fact, we've polled flood and drought preparedness and climate adaptation or resilience in the past a number of times and found that support is super high for that. And here still we're seeing something like 60, I can't remember if it's like 65% strongly support. So still a ton of support for that. I was also really heartened to see the high level of support for ensuring there's enough water for nature and wildlife to thrive. Next, we got into a series of questions about how we ought to prioritize infrastructure spending. As you all know, and I know many of you are working on this, historically, federal dollars tend to flow to white and wealthy areas. And there's been some great analysis, for instance, of state revolving fund spending that finds that trend continues. We know that's a thing with FEMA disaster relief and disaster preparedness funds. And so, since so many of our partners, including the Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus, are working to shift this dynamic, we wanted to understand where voters are on it. The good news is that a strong majority of voters think the government should prioritize communities with the greatest need versus distributing funding equally. And we had polled this question last March and found the same. Actually, at that time, I think 60% of voters. So a really solid majority are on board with targeted spending. We also shared that, that granting half of clean drinking water funds to disadvantaged communities, as is in the language of the legislation, that's the plan. And 58% said that's about the right amount, whereas 22% said it's not enough. Next, we wanted to test different descriptors to see what sort of communities, like what sort of language we should use to get voters on board with targeted infrastructure spending. And what we found is that we specifically wanted to test terms like vulnerable, disadvantaged, and frontline that are often used within the movement as a sort of shorthand. And we found that those terms generated less support than describing the impact or need. So we got 3/4 of voters on board with the idea of prioritizing communities at high risk of fires, floods, and disasters, or with high levels of pollution, or those that need federal help. But when we used a shorthand term like frontline, only half of voters agreed that they should be prioritized. To us, that suggests that these terms aren't widely understood and that we need to just unpack them and describe what the specific risk factor or need is for a community. We asked the question another way, focusing on Justice 40, and just basically asked if communities should be prioritized based on the amount of pollution, their vulnerability to climate extremes, or based on race and ethnicity. And here we found, again, super strong majorities, 80% each of voters said that communities should be prioritized if they're experiencing high levels of pollution or high vulnerability to climate extremes. However, only 51% said communities of color should be prioritized. We know that communities of color disproportionately disproportionately experience pollution and are often the most vulnerable to climate because of policy choices like, redlining, discriminatory development, inequitable infrastructure spending, et cetera. So to us, this suggests that we need to proactively connect the dots. And I wonder, Molly, if you want to say any more about polling that you all have done around like race and ethnicity.
Yeah, so we've, when we do polling like this and some of our other testing and in message testing, we've found that a message that focuses on environmental justice often isn't as persuasive as messages about health or about the economy. And that doesn't mean that we shy away from it. It means that we recommend leaning into it more. Maybe it's something that folks aren't familiar with. There's a lot of systemic and institutional racism that signals to people that maybe this isn't something that they should think about or that they should prioritize, or they're getting a lot of institutional cues about this. But the more that we can connect the dots and saying that communities of color who experience the worst air and water pollution, or kind of combine messages around environmental justice with other messages, the better we can do it at educating the folks around us.
Thanks, Molly. I forgot to mention that I'm going to pause in the middle and then we'll have time at the end for Q&A, but you should feel free to drop questions into the Q&A anytime. And then Molly will sort of be gathering them to ask during breaks. Next, I want to talk about drinking water. As I said before, voters are totally on board with the right to water. In addition to the 89% that agree that safe and affordable water is a human right, 65% strongly agreed with that idea. And for the third time this poll, we tested the idea of a permanent federal program to help low-income families pay their water bills. And we found that 75% of voters support it, with 40% strongly supporting. This is pretty consistent from when we asked this question last March, and another time last year. And in this case, we were able to, to say that, explain that there had been a temporary program created during the pandemic, and now we wanted to make it permanent. Despite that, and despite all of the work that has been done, both by advocates as well as utilities and agencies and government groups to educate ratepayers about the help that's currently available, including the low-income household water assistance program that I know many of you have worked on, 37% of voters haven't heard anything about existing programs to help families pay their water bills. And just about a third have heard some or a lot. And to us, that suggests that there's just more education needed. One of the things that we like to talk about when we're making the case for affordable drinking water is the fact that these sorts of lifeline programs already exist for other essential services, and that water is in fact, perhaps the most essential of all. But we know that we have some work to do. And so we wanted to understand like how we ought to talk about these programs, because, the acronyms like LIWAP, Low Income Household Water Affordability Water Assistance Program, can get to be a mouthful. So we tested support for a bunch of different descriptors, from water affordability to low income water rate assistance to water debt relief. And we found that the simplest actually works best here. Water affordability doesn't require anyone to have context for the issue. And so we recommend, based on this poll, that that's the sort of umbrella term that we use to describe the programs that we're advocating for at the state and federal, as well as utility level. And then underneath that, you can describe that this is for low-income ratepayers, for instance, and any specific groups that you want to make sure are included that have historically been left out, like renters. We also ask questions in the drinking water section about public utilities, and 58% prefer the idea of a public utility, and they thought that public utilities would not only deliver safer and cleaner water, but also less expensive service and more reliable service. I see we have a Maritza. Maritza, do you want to?
I apologize. That was a technical error on my end.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so carrying on. Lastly, we asked about contaminants of concern. We know lead has been in the news a ton, as it was really a central provision of, or a central talking point, certainly, in the last infrastructure package. We just asked about these four because we have a lot of multi-choice questions. And we were surprised that arsenic actually polls as a stronger concern for voters than PFAS, which has been so much in the news recently. And nitrates were, right behind PFAS. I think this, I know a number of groups on this call are working on PFAS, and I think it just, again, suggests the need to be really descriptive when we're talking about that. Obviously, a lot of us use the term forever chemicals when we are talking about this class of chemicals, but I think it can help even to unpack it further and talk about the fact that these chemicals are used in waterproofing, in nonstick, in firefighting, et cetera, and just help people understand like where they might be present in our environment, so that people can locate them in their lives. Because lead, people connect it to drinking water because they understand that, lead pipes are a thing that many homes still have. We're going to move on to the Clean Water Act next, but I'd love to pause and have Molly share any questions that have come up in the interim.
Sure. So one of the questions I'll flag that I answered that I typed in was, I believe, the first chart about the priorities are how, yes, I'm trying to find it over here, how important all of the all those priorities that the poll is about, and just what the legend was, because I believe it was cut off. All of those blues were important. The more intense blue was very important, and the lighter blue was somewhat important. So there was a lot of that was seen as very important. And again, the slides will be shared afterwards, so you can go back and look at the legend. I have a great question about looking at income and race crosstabs for those questions about what communities should be prioritized. When it's framed as impacts, there are kind of no major differences between across race and income. When it's focused on the terms that are focused on race, we do see differences by race. I'll pull up an example. So with the frontline communities example, 60% of Black voters say that frontline communities should be prioritized versus 48% of white voters, and also 62% of Hispanic voters. The one thing that I'll say here about the term frontline communities is that just is something that is used among the community, but is not necessarily as common outside of the community. And it also has multiple meanings. It's Congress people that are in vulnerable districts and are at risk of losing their elections are also called frontline members of Congress, and that's a different meaning of the word that is often used in the same context. So that's kind of where I think of that, that particular term. But you're right to point out that it is there are certain communities, specifically communities of color, that are more, that are experiencing the impacts, that are more likely to say that communities of color should be prioritized. Another question, if we connect the dots between race and exposure and vulnerability, does support based on race go up, or does support based on exposure vulnerability go down? Have you tested that? I'll do my best to answer this. I hope that I will answer your question, and if not, you can let me know. It a little bit depends, but we've often found that when we're able to connect the dots, there isn't a backlash effect. Backlash effect meaning, we say something and then support drops dramatically. We see that sometimes when something becomes politically polarized, the difference between support that is for a policy that's proposed by some members of Congress versus that's proposed by President Biden or Democrats or Republicans in Congress. So my hunch would be that connecting the dots either wouldn't have an immediate impact or it would increase support. We don't tend to see a strong backlash effect there, which is, I would be optimistic about it. I'm not necessarily optimistic about a lot of things, but I think I would not be pessimistic about this one. And there's one other question. I'm gonna very quickly pop over to my notes over here. The question was about, preferring, would you prefer your drinking water system be owned and operated by a public utility or a private for-profit company? 58% preferred public and 13% preferred private, and that remaining 29% say it doesn't make a difference either way.
Great. Thank you. And I saw a question also from Madeline about whether we're going to be putting these results out publicly. We will. We won't do a press release, and we will we'll hold back some of the questions that we just asked to inform our own strategy. But we're going to be sharing some graphics for social sharing, and then working with Climate Nexus's lobbyist, and some of our partners are welcome to use any of the polling materials with their own lobbyists or in conversations with members and legislative staff. So let's dive into the Clean Water Act. Sorry, one second. So obviously this is the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. And so first we wondered how much voters know about this. It's obviously been in the news quite a lot recently. Unsurprisingly, just a little over a third have heard some or a lot about the Clean Water Act. Despite this, however, clean water is an almost universal concern. We know that it polls as a bipartisan priority, both pollution prevention, clean and safe rivers and streams, et cetera. We did ask a question about the purposes for which we ought to protect clean water, and I'm curious to what you all will think. So I'm going to pop up the next poll, which is around what purpose do you think voters feel it's most important that rivers and lakes be safe for? Swimming, drinking, fishing, or fish and wildlife? All right. And according to you all, you guessed that drinking would be at the top, followed by fish and wildlife, swimming, and fishing. I also thought that drinking would be at the top, and I was quite surprised to find that more voters said it's very important that rivers, lakes, and streams be safe for fish and wildlife than drinking, fishing, or swimming. And this is really heartening, actually, because we have asked a bunch of questions about fish and wildlife in the context of drought and water supply, and often find that that isn't a primary motivator for people. So it's a great reminder that, at least in terms of water quality, people definitely want to ensure that our waterways are safe for the plants and animals that live there. We also asked voters, we let voters know that about half of assessed rivers and streams are considered impaired. We said unsafe for drinking, swimming, and fishing. And we asked them what we ought to do about this, or what responses they're most supportive of. Unsurprisingly, we see this trend almost whenever we give people this menu of options. We gave them cleanup efforts, stronger laws, or stronger enforcement. And we found that people are most supportive of stronger cleanup efforts, with stronger enforcement dropping to the bottom. Now, we all know that enforcement of existing laws is a gap, right? That there are capacity challenges, and that there's also often a lack of political will. This, however, isn't on the radar of a lot of people. And we asked this question in our last poll last year about what people thought were the primary drivers of water pollution or water contamination, and found that lax enforcement just wasn't on the radar of voters. Doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it, right? And some of our partners are engaged in campaigns right now to to shore up government groups' regulatory and enforcement efforts. It just means that we need to lead with the goal, which is water that's safe for all the things we care about, from fish to boating and swimming. And then we need to connect the dots between how enforcement gets us to there. We also asked a question about what kinds of pollution voters are most concerned about. And I've seen this question polled with a different range of answers a bunch of times. And typically the trend we see is that like industrial waste is near the top, because that's been in the news since the origins of the Clean Water Act, right? It's something that I think is really part of our nation's clean water story. Plastic pollution also tends to be quite high. I think this is the result of it being very visible in our waterways, but also all the great advocacy that's been happening around bag bans and straw bans and the like. I was surprised, however, at the level of concern around agricultural runoff and urban and suburban runoff. We tend, when we're communicating about those kinds of pollution, to try to unpack those terms. So rather than saying agricultural runoff, we'll talk about, chemical fertilizers and pesticides and manure running off farms. And when we're talking about urban and suburban runoff, we'll talk about things like road salt and motor oil and lawn chemicals. So I think the more descriptive we can be, the more we paint a picture of the problem, the more that people can understand the threat, because they know what's in some of those compounds and how they don't want to be drinking them. But also the more that they can start to understand where the vulnerability is to these kinds of pollutions and what sort of solutions might be indicated to prevent it. And I'd say just sort of like big picture takeaway from this is that voters are really concerned about all sorts of kinds of pollution. And I think that really does present an opportunity to talk about stronger laws and stronger enforcement. We just need to, again, do that dot connecting. I'm going to delve into farm policy and drought, and then we'll catch the rest of the questions at the end. So actually, before we get into we are going to get into that. So we wanted to ask questions about the Farm Bill, because we know many of our partners, including the Clean Water for All Coalition, are working on it. But before we got into specifics, we asked voters about goals for farm policy generally. And I was really pleased to see that the #1 priority voters have for farm policy is protecting the health of people who eat the food, followed by protecting the environment. I thought that keeping store shelves stocked, in this time, because remember in June 2022, when we were doing this polling, we had just come from pandemic supply chain issues, and then we were experiencing war in Ukraine supply chain issues. And there's been so much press about the Western drought and how it's going to impact food, which we'll get into in the next section. So the fact that voters think farm policy ought to focus on our health and that of the world around us, I think is a really great foundation to build from when we're advocating for more, more sustainable or regenerative farm policies and practices. We also tested a series of statements just to get a sense of, what's the philosophy that voters hold or agree with in terms of food and farming. 2/3 agree that people deserve nutritious food grown without synthetic chemicals. And more than half believe that food should be grown in harmony with nature and agree that healthy soils are essential for reducing climate change. That there wasn't a ton of clarity. We wanted to ask a couple of questions about small versus large farms, and we found that just about 1/3 agreed that small local farms can better meet community needs, but the same amount agreed that large farms can produce more food at lower prices. Next, on the very specific provisions of the Farm Bill, we let voters know that there, by about a 3-to-1 margin, there are more applications currently for conservation grants and loans than there are funds provided in the Farm Bill, and asked if voters support doubling the amount of conservation money in the Farm Bill. 8 in 10 said yes. And the good news continued when we asked questions about what programs should the Farm Bill fund. All of these are strong majorities, right? But the strongest level of support for helping farmers grow food for people, that seems natural. I will say, though, that 91% also support the idea of helping farmers grow food for livestock. This was on our mind because obviously, the Water Hub sits at Climate Nexus. We're thinking a lot about how animal agriculture contributes to climate change, as well as being incredibly water intensive and generating a lot of water pollution in the West. And so we just wondered, if people are on board with the idea of, investing a little bit more in growing food for people, a little bit less in growing food for livestock. We didn't necessarily see that result in the poll, but this was the only question we asked about that. We did, however, see really strong support for policies that protect clean air and protect clean water, as well as slowing climate change. And we even saw, 2/3 of voters on board with the idea of eliminating subsidies for factory farms. So these sorts of results, again, we're happy to share the top lines and the crosstabs. And if they're useful in your advocacy efforts, we're happy to, equip you with whatever materials would be supportive. We wanted to ask some questions about healthy soils, because obviously we know how important they are for slowing climate change, as well as for preventing pollution and growing good food. And we wanted to know what voters understand about them. So we just asked a series of questions about, after sharing that one of the goals of the Farm Bill is to enrich and stabilize our nation's soil, we asked people, what's a good reason to do this? Growing crops with less fertilizer rose to the top, followed by filtering out pollution, retaining moisture, absorbing carbon, and reducing dust storms and erosion. This is an area, I think, where, we have more education to do. I think that the value of soil is sort of poorly understood. And actually one of our advisory group members, Arohi Sharma from NRDC, has done quite a lot of advocacy around this. I know many other groups have, but I think, hopefully this will be useful, but probably an area that bears more research. I want to mention also under farm policy and drinking water that we asked some questions about, what comes to mind for people when we use terms like regenerative agriculture, sustainable agriculture, or agroecology. We'll share the results in the follow-up materials. We also asked some questions about One Water and found that term isn't widely understood, much like regenerative and sustainable agriculture. So I think those, we'll share what we learned, but in both cases, I think it really indicates an opportunity to do more education and unpack those terms. The last section that we want to dig into before we open it up for more questions is on drought. Not surprisingly, given how much it's been in the news, 84% of voters are concerned about drought in the Western United States. I was, however, surprised by this next response. We asked people whether they think drought in the West is the result of human-caused climate change, and just half said yes, while 1/3 said that it's the result of normal weather variation. So I wanted to invite Molly to provide a little bit of perspective on this response.
Yeah, so as Nicole said, I was also a little bit surprised by this. And that's because we've seen recently and also over the last few years that, right, people are connecting extreme weather events to climate change more and more. They want their elected officials to connect the dots. They want the media to connect the dots, and they are connecting the dots. But often those dots are being connected around storms. So think when it's hurricane season and there's a lot of conversation about climate change, or extreme rainstorms or extreme heat, and less around drought. So I think, again, this is a place where we know that connecting the dots on climate change and extreme weather helps, and that it does help voters and folks in the US make those connections. But this is just something that isn't necessarily, the Weather Channel isn't as much, it doesn't have a fancy banner and there aren't names for droughts. So just less talked about as compared to other forms of extreme weather.
Thanks, Molly. Yeah, and I know that a lot of scientists are saying we should use the term aridification rather than drought, because that, we're not experiencing a temporary cyclical drought. In fact, this is a long-term drying trend. I'm trying to remember, we may have tested that term we did a California specific drought poll in January, which I'll include in the follow-up materials. We may have tested that term. I think it's still a very poorly understood term. And so we tend to default to using terms like drought or mega drought, and then explaining how bad it is and how much it's been exacerbated by climate change because of extreme heat and because of the now longer duration of droughts. Actually, let me back up. Last poll, I would love to find out, because some of our partners are differentiating between the changes in weather and our water challenges, and trying to help voters understand that it's not that there's not necessarily enough water to go around. It's that the choices we make about our water supply are creating the risk of shortages. And so would love to hear your thoughts on what you think voters believe is the top cause of Western water challenges. So you all guessed correctly again, that voters think that the growth of cities and suburbs is most responsible, despite the fact that urban areas, use quite a small amount of water relative to agriculture in the West. I'll stop sharing those and pop up the full results. We asked the question, do you think each of these is impacting Western water challenges? Some, a lot, not at all, or a little, I think. And growth of cities and suburbs was at the top, while overplanting of crops in dry areas was near the bottom, followed only by overly strict environmental laws. I think it's fair to say that voters recognize that there is a range based on these results, that there are a number of things that are coming together to contribute to water challenges. But I think it indicates that there's a lot more work to do to communicate where our water goes and where the biggest opportunities for conservation are. And I think the reason that we see so many voters thinking that urban water use is the problem is because that's been a big part of the press is like, oh, this population boom and these huge metropolises springing up in the desert and they're so thirsty. But also a lot of government messaging and utility messaging is focused on individual actions in the home or in our yards. And so I think there's this sort of ongoing messaging that voters are receiving that it's everyone's job to conserve. And therefore, those of us who live in cities and suburbs are probably the main drivers of shortages. Next, we asked about who or what is the drought impacting? And not surprisingly, voters believe that drought is having a large effect. The dark blue is having a large effect on wildfires, food prices, fish and wildlife, and the economy. More than half of voters, or about half of voters, chose each of those. Food access and the range of food available was up there. We included a question about national security because there's been quite a lot of media coming out of the farm lobby suggesting that if we don't continue to give water to irrigators in the West, then we're going to offshore our food production the way we have manufacturing, and that's going to impact our national security. That message isn't yet resonating with voters, or at least they aren't connecting the dots from drought to national security currently. But I would say that's an area that we might want to do more research. We did ask a specific question about, what are you worried about if we give farmers and ranchers less water for irrigation? What concerns do you have? And not surprisingly, food access rose to the top. 56% chose that as their top concern, and just about 10% chose all of the rest, including dust storms, loss of income for farm workers and other businesses, and the decline of rural communities. And I would say that this, when we are communicating about the need for increased agricultural efficiency, or, in some cases in the West right now, about the need to transition land out of agriculture or into different kinds of agriculture, I think it's important to emphasize that we can continue to feed people while saving water. And so, knowing how important local food access is to voters, or not even necessarily local, actually we didn't specify that here. I think it's important to mitigate this concern by making it clear in our messaging that less water for farming doesn't mean the end to farming in the West. Next, we tested a variety of drought solutions, and we asked people to select the top 3 responses. So this chart shows all the people that included this option in their top 3. And here, as we've seen in lots of past polls, conservation and efficiency rose to the top, whereas desalination and new dams and reservoirs sunk to the bottom. That's been consistent across all the polls the Water Hub has done for the past 3 years. Doesn't mean that people don't support new dams and reservoirs or groundwater, as we noted here, but it does, I think, suggest that people intuitively recognize that making wiser use and reuse of current supplies is going to be the most cost-effective and most sort of sensible solution to start with, and I think that's really good news. We wanted to test this idea of, an all of the above water strategy versus prioritizing some sources, because we're hearing a lot of politicians talk about all of the above water in the way that we would never do in the energy world these days, right? It's widely understood by voters that some energy sources are objectively better than others. They're cleaner, they're greener. I don't think that we have that in the water world, but we did find that over half of voters think we should prioritize water sources that are both cost effective and good for the climate, while less than half liked the idea or preferred the idea of an all of the above water strategy. We've been playing a little bit at the Water Hub with the concept of no regrets water sources to describe things like water efficiency or conservation, and we can talk about how they multi-solve for different problems like energy and emissions as well as water scarcity. So anyway, if you want to think with us on that, we'd love your thoughts. When we digging into conservation, we see the same trend that we often see, which is that people prefer voluntary programs to stronger laws or to financial penalties. Much stronger support, in fact, for voluntary water saving programs than stronger laws or rates that encourage water savings. Just quickly, I want to share my takeaways from the poll, and I'll invite Molly to add any, and then we will get to the Q&A. So the good news, again, is that safe and affordable drinking water, clean water for fish and wildlife and people, and water conservation and efficiency already poll really high. So voters are there on principle, but not always policy. And what that means is that it's on us as communicators and advocates to bridge from what people already care and worry about to things that can help us address their concerns or values. One other big takeaway that I want to mention is that these shorthand technical terms that we use, internally or that are used in policy or regulatory settings don't always make sense to voters. And so we should unpack them and use really simple language and go a step further. And if we're talking about, a pollution source, for instance, describe where it's coming from, what it looks like, how it shows up in our lives. Similarly, when we're making the case for targeted investments in communities, describe why they need the investment, both, past and present. I think often that historical context can be really valuable. Anything you want to add before we get to the questions, Molly?
Yeah, I'll just add one thing on that. The final point about using language and meeting people where they are which is often how I think about when I'm writing questions. And the example that I often give on this, we do in addition to water polling, a lot of climate polling and a lot of polling around gas, and specifically natural gas. But we know that natural gas is not natural. It was that's a term used by the industry to make us feel really good about using it, when really we should be calling it methane gas or fossil gas or fracked gas. But when we poll on it, we do still ask about natural gas, because those are the words that people know, as much as it's frustrating to play into the industry's framing. So we ask about that in our polling, and then communications materials will say natural gas, which is mostly composed of methane or something like that. I know there are a few questions in the Q&A, and I love thinking about different words, because obviously everyone's coming to this from a different perspective, but always trying to make sure that respondents are going to know what we're talking about, so that we're measuring their actual opinions about what's around them. All right, I'm going to jump into some of these questions. Some of them I think Nicole will be much better equipped to answer. But I'll start with some of the questions around regional breakouts. So Grace asked about that question about droughts being caused by climate change or if they're human caused. I moved away from it. Whether there are partisan or geographic differences. There are partisan differences. 69% of Democrats and only 30% of Republicans say that drought is caused by human-caused climate change. What I'll say there is Republicans are less likely to believe that climate change is human-caused. But we have seen in a lot of our polling that younger Republicans, so Republicans under the age of 35, are much more likely than older Republicans to say that climate change is human caused. So it's not, and I can dig into that a little bit further in this poll if you're curious, but it's not all Republicans, but you're right about that. And as far as geography on that, often, so when we look at geography, we'll usually look at census regions, so the Northeast, the South, the Midwest, and the West. Folks in the West are slightly more likely than folks in other regions to say that drought is caused by human-caused climate change, but that's 55% in the West compared to 48% in the South. So there aren't huge differences there, and that's generally true. There often aren't huge geographic differences when we look at region. Same with some of these other questions about region. I can look into the data further, and if you have further questions about the data, feel free to email Nicole and she can kind of forward those requests to me. But again, in general, region doesn't tend to be the biggest factor where we see differences. It often is things like party or gender or race and ethnicity. Let's see. There are a couple of questions about where we showed, what was the question? Oh, how important
it was about, which purpose is it most important the rivers, lakes, and streams be safe for? And both Sarah and Robert asked, does this actually mean that people don't know where their drinking water comes from? I think that's a perceptive question, Sarah and Robert. We know that people don't know where their drinking water comes from. That's definitely been tested by the water main. In a poll, I think that was about 2 years ago, And there have been a number of other polls that have asked people. I think something like 37% of voters across the polls that I've seen know where their drinking water comes from. So yes, definitely there is a gap in knowledge there. We also had a bunch of questions about like either things that they felt were missing from the ag section or the wording on questions. I'll say that, you know, we sort of max out in terms of a polling questionnaire at 30-ish questions, especially as you notice, some of the questions were pretty complex and had 6 or more options. And so we couldn't ask everything we wanted. We did not ask about corn ethanol, for example. And you're right, we didn't ask about farm ownership, big family farms versus big ag. I believe we've done some polling on that in the past. And I think, you know, generally the public perception is that family farms are what ag is made of. I don't think there's a wide recognition among voters of how corporate agriculture is in the US. We're just starting to think really about our next poll, which is going to focus at least or dig a little bit more into the language of water equity. So if you want to, you know, have question ideas, want to, you know, raise your hand to engage, you can drop me a line. My email is up there and we welcome that. We did invite input from a number of partners on this polling questionnaire, and we'll do the same for our next one.
And as much as we, you know, again, really appreciate everyone's feedback here, because as much as we looked at the questionnaire and shared it with a lot of people, it always happens that we field it and it comes back and we say, man, I wish we had asked about this thing. So there's always more polling to do. So appreciate everyone's thoughts there. There was a question from Kaylin about if polling has looked at whether voters think that climate change is making drought worse, and they do. That's we asked about this in the Water Hub poll from March of 2021. We asked whether folks thought that a bunch of different extreme weather events were more severe, less severe, or about the same over the last 5 years. And that was droughts, wildfires, increased flooding, stronger storms, and extreme heat. And among the folks who said that, yes, these events are getting more severe, we then asked, do you think that climate change has a major, minor, or no influence on those things? And so with drought, we find that 51% of the folks who say that drought is getting more extreme say that climate change is having a major influence, along with 30% who say it's having a minor influence, 12% who say no influence, and 7% who say not sure. In the context of the other extreme weather events, it's about the same across them. About half of folks say that climate change is having a major influence on all of these extreme weather events. So I think, right, we're seeing that folks are seeing these events more, both out in the world and in their own communities. And a good number of folks are connecting the dots. But again, the more dot connecting we can get, we'll get that number higher. So it's not just 50% of the folks who say that they're seeing more severe storms in their area.
I'm trying to think if there's anything else we did not get to here, Molly. In terms of, yes, we know cleanups are unsustainable and the prevention is better. Daryl, we did not test that. And we certainly didn't create an innovation in cleanup methods. And an anonymous attendee asked about like self-reporting versus actual behavior and voting, spending, et cetera. We didn't dig into that, but I wonder, Molly, if you want to talk about sort of trends that you've seen in public opinion research on that.
Yeah, and that's a great question, right? People are more likely to say that they'll do something than to actually do it. So, for example, when we talk about findings, and we ask a question, something like, how likely would you be to share this on social media? I'll always, when I'm reporting that data, I'll always say like X% of people say that they would, because we know that that's maybe not going to happen. There are a couple of ways of dealing with that. You can sometimes, if it's about voting, you can match results back to the voter file. You can ask people about if they think that someone else would be likely to do it, which kind of takes it outside of their own wanting to seem like a good person to the folks that are doing the survey. And one other note is that we conduct a lot of our polls online. This poll was conducted entirely online. And so we see a little bit less of that happening in online polls. It's more common when you're talking to a person and you want to seem like a good person to them. And you say, yes, of course, I recycle all the time and I do all these great things. When you're taking a survey anonymously, there's less of that pressure. But I think that's a great point and something to look into more. There are a lot of polls that ask people to self-report their behaviors about, whether it's water saving or the amount of money that they're willing to spend on something. And we kind of have to take that with, knowing that it's going to be an inflated number, but that, we can look at, the intensity. So if we ask, if you're very or somewhat likely to do something, we can look at that very likely category. Those are people that are more motivated and are more likely to do it than someone who says, yeah, I'm somewhat likely, like, I guess I could. And, those people are probably not going to do it in real life.
Great. I think we maybe just have time for one more question. We got one asking if the South census region stood out in any way in terms of voters' responses. I know, Molly, you may not have had a chance to do that regional analysis.
Yeah, I haven't looked so deeply. Like I said, region is often not the biggest factor. What we do see is in questions that we ask about, have you seen drought in your local community? The places that are experiencing drought are more likely to say yes than no. I'm happy to dig in a little bit closer and let you know if I find anything interesting, but we often see that, also because the regions encompass a lot of states and encompass a lot of people, that they tend to look similar across region.
Awesome. With that, I think we will wrap up, but we will be sending out, the slides, the recording, the written report, and the top lines, as well as some other public opinion research resources. And then feel free to follow up by email if you have additional questions that we didn't get to or that pop for you in the review. And thank you so much for joining us. And thanks, Molly, for joining as well.